Welcome to the migration module for Auth Manager 7.1 to Auth Manager 8.0. Okay, with Auth Manager 7.1 to 8.0, we're going to go through a number of different aspects to it. We'll talk about the differences from the Auth Manager 6.1 to 8.0 migration, some of the scenarios that are available, as well as some of the data not migrated, and potentially some of the gotchas that you may run across. So the first question is, how is Auth Manager 7.1 to 8.0 migration different than 6.1 to 8.0? And there are a few differences. The first is that 7.1 has no export utility out of the box like 6.1 had. Instead, we included the export utility as part of AM 8.0 on the Utilities DVD. That can also be downloaded from SCOL, Secure Care Online. It has to be installed on the 7.1 systems that you plan to export from. So if you're planning to do only a primary export, then you only need to install it on the primary. However, if you need to install it, or if you need to export the Delta records off of the replicas, you'll need to install it on the replicas as well. With 6.1 to 8.0, there were a lot of data model changes. So it was really a lot of apples to oranges conversions that had to happen as part of the migration process. With Auth Manager 7.1, that really isn't the case anymore. The data model is very similar to Auth Manager 8, so there are very few data translations that are actually necessary as part of the migration process. So that should make for a much easier migration process. In general, we've done a lot of optimizations as well, so the data migration is generally faster from 7 to 8 than it was from 6 to 8, or from 6 to 7. The Auth Manager 6.1 migration allowed for multiple or partial migrations to 7 or 8. Now with 7.1 to 8 is really an all or nothing proposition. You can't combine multiple deployments as part of the migration process. However, there is an import-export functionality in 8 that may allow that later on. And so some of the details around migration. Auth Manager 7.1 SP4 is required to migrate to AM8. So customers that are on SP2 or 3 or don't have an SP at all, they have to get to SP4 prior to migrating to Auth Manager 8. The migration times will vary based on hardware, the export platform, and the database size. So the bigger the system, or the bigger the database rather, then the slower the system, the longer it will take. In addition, Solaris is generally going to take a bit longer than, for example, Windows or Linux. But for most customers, the export is pretty quick, less than 20 minutes each, and the import is relatively fast as well. So let's walk through some of the steps of the migration. The first step is really to install the migration export utility on Auth Manager 7.1, at least on the primary, and then optionally on the replicas. At that point, you'll be doing an export of the migration package, and there's a couple options there. The first one is to do a primary only export with the servers up and running. Typically, when you're testing the system on the 8.0 side, you can do an export from 7.1, drop it into an 8.0 system, and test it for a while before going into production. You can do a primarily only export with the servers down. You would expect this would be a production migration at this point. Generally, the quickest way of doing a migration is to bring down the primary and the replicas and do the migration over, and then bring up your 8.0 systems online. And the last one is the export of all instances. And at this point now, you're collecting all of the data off of each of the servers, and you're doing a cutover from there. So you'll use this particular option when you want to catch all of the Delta records off of the replicas as well. No matter what mode you're going into with the migration, you'll always do the import of the migration package via the 8.0 operations console. And we've also introduced now the concept of a refresh for pre-production databases. So you can do a test migration from 7.1 to 8, and then test for any number of days, weeks, or months on the 8.0 side. Get your system settings set up, web tiers, replicas, and all of that. Get that set up in a test environment. And then when it's time to actually cut over into production, you can refresh only the runtime data, the variable objects such as users, tokens, agents, policies, while basically retaining all of your system settings, replica topology, and so forth. We'll talk more about that. So the installation of the migration export utility can be done on any 7.1 platform, whether it be an appliance, Solaris, Windows, Linux, and it has to be installed on the replica instances if you want to export replica data in particular. It doesn't take long to install, just a minute or two. And it can be installed either in a UI mode for those of you on Windows or Linux, or it can be run in command line utility mode for those of you, for example, on the appliance 3.0. It does require OS access to install and run, so be aware of that. During the export process, the user must input the AM7.1 migration package password. So this will basically be used to encrypt the migration package. You'll be doing this in migration mode, and you basically you got to input what migration mode you want, and export specify the output location for the migration package. The export usually takes just a few minutes. On the import side, as I mentioned, it occurs via the operations console. You can simply upload it through the browser if it's less than 2 gig. Otherwise, you can import it. Basically, you copy it to the actual disk of the appliance itself and point to that location. Or you can put it on a WinShare or NFS and point to it there. On the import side, you'll need to enter the migration package password to decrypt the package. So it should be noted that obviously they'll need to remember what that password is. The import side, again, varies on the hardware and database size, but generally just takes a few minutes. So there are several migration scenarios. The first one is the test migration. Basically, this is that services up migration export option, where basically you're going to set up a sandbox or pre-production environment in your virtual environment. And you can use that environment for testing and blow it away, or you can use it as a pre-production environment and go live at a later time. There's the basic migration. This is going into production. It's the fastest and simplest method of migration. So either you'll bring down your primary and export your data off of your primary, and you can either leave your replicas running and have them field authentications, but you will leave any replications or authentication data that happened on the replicas behind. So for example, if there were any new PIN modes or next token code updates or anything like that, you will lose those by not migrating that replica data. The other option is to bring down all of your replicas as well, in which case you know that your database will be completely up to date when you migrate, but the downside is that you will have some authentication downtime during migration. This will be the best fit for the majority of customers because it is simple and relatively fast. The third mode is advanced migration. This is a little more complex and time-consuming, but it allows the benefit of having full uptime and retaining nearly all authentication data. The complication is that you have to install the export utility on every replica as well as the primary. And if you roll back, you have to run the export utility to reset the primary for production again and basically turn the replicas back on, the replication engines back on. That's basically the process for the rolling back there. And the last one is the pre-production refresh, as I mentioned before. It basically allows the customers to refresh a configured pre-production environment with the latest production data prior to going live. This is a basic migration sequence where you have a primary only cutting over to a primary in Auth Manager 8 with a different IP address. And you're basically going to bring it online by changing the IP address. So here you can see the primary 7.1 system has been brought down and an export packages has been created. At this point, the agents are no longer able to authenticate. There, the package is then imported into the 8.0 primary. And at that point, then, you can change the IP address of the primary to match the IP address of the old primary. At this point now, the agents are switched over, and they don't even know that a transition actually happened, that the cutover actually even happened. Here we'll go through a basic migration sequence with a primary and 2 replicas, and as well an AM8.0 VM that has been set up with a different IP address than the production systems. So here we shut down the primary, but the replicas continue to authenticate, and at that point a package is created. The package is imported into the AM8.0 primary, which is not in production at this time, and then we bring down the replicas as we bring up the 8.0 replicas with different IP addresses. At this point, the agents are not able to authenticate, and then we change the IP addresses and host names on each of the primary and replica systems in AM8 to match what they were on the 7.1 side. And at that point now the agents can authenticate. So what is a pre-production refresh? The refresh really updates a pre-production environment with the latest production data, but it leaves a number of aspects of the pre-production system intact. So attached replicas are left alone, system settings are left alone, self-service and configuration and customizations are left alone, along with active web tiers. And this really enables customers to test in a sandbox environment and then easily move that environment into production while maintaining the confidence of having tested their pre-production environment thoroughly. So let's walk through how a migration refresh works. So you'll see here that there's an AM71 system in production with system settings, users, tokens, and so forth. And then there's an Auth Manager 8.0 sandbox set up as well that was done through a test migration at some time in the past. And it has users, tokens, and secure domains, and it also has system settings and replicas as well as web tiers and self-service settings set up. Here we'll do another export. At this point, one could assume it's a production export. So the security domains, users, tokens, on-demand policies, agents, all that stuff is taken out of the 7.1 system and exported into AM8. But the system settings, replica configuration, web tiers, and so forth are all left alone on the AM80 side. All of that stuff remains untouched. At that point now, my AM80 sandbox is matched up with what my 7.1 system had, and now my test environment is ready for production through the simple IP cutover or by updating my agents. Okay, let's walk through a basic migration sequence now with a refresh. Here they'll have no data loss, but they will experience some downtime. Here, the primary system is left up and running while it creates an export package, so the environment's fully in production still. At that point, we import the package into the primary, which is still just in a test sandbox. Now we add a couple of replicas to create this test environment. And now we're at some point done with testing and ready to actually do a production migration. So we'll do an export and while bringing the primary down and create a refresh migration package. We'll import that package into the primary and we'll shut down the replicas on the 7.1 side. So now the production system is completely down. Now one by one we'll re-IP and hostname the primary and the replicas to match the primary and replicas in the 7.1 environment, or conversely we could also update the agents. At this point now, the cutover is complete and the new 8.0 system is online. Okay, let's walk through the advanced migration sequence with a refresh. This scenario offers no data loss and no downtime, but it is a little more complicated. Here we'll have a primary and 2 replicas and migrate to another environment with a primary and 2 replicas. So here we'll have the services up while we create an export package. We'll import that package into the primary system. Now we'll actually create new replicas and complete the test environment. So we'll set up web tiers, we'll set up self-service potentially, all the system settings I need to configure. Now I'm actually ready to go into production. So I'll export from the primary, shutting it down and creating an export package. But at the same time now, the replica systems are up and running and collecting Delta records all the while. So authentications still are happening through those replicas. We're going to take that package and import it into the test AM80 system. And at this point now, it's going to re-IP the primary system so that it matches the IP address of the 7.1 primary system. Now the 8.0 primary is in production along with the 7.1 replicas. Next, we'll have one replica come down and export its Delta data. Meanwhile, replica 2 stays up and running. We'll import the package now into the primary via the operations console. And now we'll change the replica IP address and host name to match that of the old 7.1 replica. And now it becomes online. At this point now, we'll bring down the second replica and export its data. We'll import that package into the primary, again via the OC. And now we'll change the IP address and host name of the last replica to match the IP and host name of the last 7.1 replica. And now at this point, all of your primary replicas are now in production, and at this point you haven't lost any authentications or any downtime. Some data is not migrated from 7.1. That can include report output, virtual realms. If there are any virtual realms that were used, for example, in the MSSP case, those are now converted into security domains. For those customers that use remote radius, remote RSA radius to be clear, those will be converted into local radius, as Auth Manager 8 will not support a remote RSA radius on a different server than the actual appliance. Things like console session settings, backup restore settings, self-service requests, those won't get migrated, so you'll have to configure those in your test environment before you get going. In addition, instance-specific data like SNMP configuration log settings also aren't migrated, so be sure to go ahead and set those up prior or during your migration. There are a couple gotchas you should watch out for. Avoid log migration if possible, as it does prolong the migration time. If a customer actually does need to migrate the logs, we can migrate them, and it's simply a checkbox to decide whether or not you want to migrate them or not, but it will take longer to migrate logs. Make sure you fulfill self-service requests prior to migration. As we said, the migration requests do not get migrated, so fulfill those, and then you can start over again when you get to Auth Manager 8, start requesting new tokens and so forth. As I said, there are multiple AM7.1 deployments can't be migrated directly to a single AM8 deployment. If you do have multiple AM7.1 deployments for a particular customer that need to be migrated into a single deployment, you should migrate each of those 7.1 deployments to Auth Manager 8, and then use the user token import-export functionality in Auth Manager 8 to consolidate deployments on the 8.0 side. And if you are planning to have a trust from Auth Manager 7.1 to Auth Manager 8 on a migrated system, you should move to patch 23, which will have a fix on the Auth Manager 7.1 side that will enable the cross-trust to be migrated properly. Okay, and that concludes our training portion. Thank you, and I hope you have many successful migrations.